April 16th, 1945. The morning fog hung thick over the Ruhr Valley as Technical Sergeant James Patrick Sullivan sat hunched in the cramped rear compartment of a modified B-17 bomber, 7,000 feet above what remained of industrial Germany. His fingers moved across the dials of his SCR 522 radio set with practiced precision, adjusting frequencies that seemed to produce nothing but static and interference. The 23-year-old from Philadelphia had been stationed with the 8th Air Force's Radio Intelligence Unit for 18 months, and in all that time, his superiors had never quite understood what he was doing. Most assumed his equipment was malfunctioning. The headphones pressed against his ears delivered nothing but the familiar hiss and crackle of electromagnetic noise, punctuated occasionally by brief bursts of German voice traffic that faded as quickly as they appeared. To anyone watching him work, Sullivan appeared to be a technician, endlessly fiddling with broken equipment, chasing signals that led nowhere, documenting patterns that meant nothing. His notebooks were filled with frequency notations, timestamps, and observations that his commanding officers had stopped reading months ago. They had no idea that the strange, seemingly random transmissions Sullivan had been cataloguing would soon crack open one of the most fortified positions in Western Europe, revealing a vulnerability no bomb or artillery shell had yet discovered. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the account of how one radio operator's dismissed observations became the key to dismantling a fortress that had withstood 3 years of concentrated air raids, and how his persistence would save thousands of lives in the final weeks of the European conflict. It is a story about the power of careful observation, the value of technical expertise, and the way that wars can be won not just with overwhelming force, but with understanding and ingenuity. James Sullivan had not intended to become a soldier. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood in South Philadelphia, he had spent his childhood fascinated by radio. While other boys played baseball or explored the neighborhoods, young James sat in his bedroom building crystal radio sets from scavenged parts, staying up late to pull in distant stations. His father, a machinist at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, encouraged this interest, recognizing in his son an aptitude for technical work that could lead to opportunities beyond the factory floor. By the time Sullivan graduated from high school in 1939, he had already built several functioning radio receivers and had begun experimenting with transmitters, much to the annoyance of neighbors whose own radio reception was occasionally disrupted by his amateur broadcasts. The scholarship to technical school came as a relief to the Sullivan family. The Great Depression had been hard on everyone, and the prospect of James earning a degree without burdening the family financially was a blessing. He threw himself into his studies, excelling particularly in courses on electromagnetic theory and signal propagation. His instructors recognized his talent, but they also noted something else about the young man. Sullivan had an almost obsessive attention to detail, a tendency to notice patterns and anomalies that others overlooked. While his classmates focused on getting equipment to work, Sullivan wanted to understand why it worked, what the signals were doing as they propagated through space, how interference and noise affected transmission quality. It was this combination of technical skill and analytical mindset that would eventually bring him to the attention of military recruiters. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, the military services found themselves in desperate need of personnel who could operate and maintain increasingly sophisticated radio and radar equipment. Sullivan received his draft notice in May 1943, just weeks before he was scheduled to complete his studies. The interruption was frustrating, but like millions of other young Americans, he reported for duty with a sense of both patriotic obligation and personal uncertainty about what lay ahead. Basic training at Fort Dix, New Jersey, was a jarring experience for the bookish young man. The physical demands, the shouting drill sergeants, the institutional regimentation, all of it seemed designed to break down individuality and rebuild men as interchangeable parts of a military machine. But Sullivan endured, knowing that his technical background would likely lead to an assignment that utilized his skills. He was right. After completing basic training, he was selected for specialized radio operator training at Fort Monmouth, where the Signal Corps ran an intensive program preparing technicians for service with the Army Air Forces. The training at Fort Monmouth was rigorous, but fascinating. Sullivan excelled at Morse code, achieving proficiency at speeds that impressed even veteran instructors. He learned radio theory, antenna design, propagation characteristics, and the practical skills of setting up and operating military radio equipment under field conditions. But what set him apart from his peers was his performance in a specialized course on signals intelligence and radio direction finding. While most students viewed this as just another technical subject to master, Sullivan found himself captivated by the idea that radio transmissions could reveal information beyond their intended content. The patterns of when signals appeared, their frequency characteristics, their strength and direction, all of these factors could provide intelligence about enemy capabilities and intentions. It was this aptitude that led to his assignment to the 8th Air Force's Radio Intelligence Section in England. By the time Sullivan arrived at the airbase near Oxford in October 1943, the strategic bombing campaign against Germany was intensifying. Massive formations of American bombers were striking targets throughout occupied Europe and Germany itself, while British Bomber Command conducted nighttime raids. The air war generated enormous amounts of signals intelligence, German radar stations tracking incoming bombers, fighter controllers coordinating defensive responses, reconnaissance aircraft reporting Allied movements, transport and logistics networks maintaining supply lines. All of this created a dense electromagnetic environment that signals intelligence personnel worked to exploit. Sullivan's assigned workspace was in a converted hangar that had been partitioned into small compartments, each housing an analyst and their equipment. The space was cold in winter, stifling in summer, and perpetually filled with the background hum of radio equipment and the clicking of typewriters as analysts transcribed their observations. The work was tedious and often unrewarding. Most signals were routine military traffic, encrypted communications that could not be read without access to code-breaking resources that were concentrated at higher echelon facilities. The role of tactical signals intelligence was to track patterns, identify changes in enemy communications networks, and occasionally catch unencrypted transmissions that might provide immediate tactical value. For the first several months, Sullivan performed his duties competently but without distinction. He monitored assigned frequencies, logged traffic, prepared reports that were forwarded to higher headquarters, where they were presumably analyzed and incorporated into intelligence summaries. The work felt disconnected from the actual war. While bomber crews risked their lives over enemy territory and ground forces fought across Europe, Sullivan sat in a cold hangar listening to static and filling out forms. He sometimes wondered if his technical skills might be better utilized elsewhere, perhaps with a tactical unit closer to actual combat operations. It was in late February 1945 that Sullivan's routine was disrupted by an observation that would ultimately change the course of his war. He had been assigned to monitor a block of high-frequency radio spectrum used primarily by German military communications in the Ruhr Valley region. The task was straightforward: note any signals, attempt to identify their source and purpose, log the information for analysis. The Ruhr was a priority intelligence target. As Germany's industrial heartland, the region contained critical coal mines, steel mills and manufacturing facilities that sustained the German military effort. Allied forces were preparing for a major push into the area, and any intelligence about German defensive preparations or troop dispositions could prove valuable. On the evening of February 22nd, Sullivan detected a brief signal that appeared on his monitoring equipment at precisely 2100 hours and 12 seconds. The signal lasted approximately 5 seconds, transmitted on a frequency of 8.75 MHz. In itself, this was unremarkable. The airwaves over Germany were constantly busy with military traffic, but something about the signal caught Sullivan's attention. It was unusually clean and consistent, showing none of the frequency drift or power variations typical of mobile transmitters. The signal appeared and disappeared with mechanical precision, as if generated by equipment connected to a highly accurate timepiece. Sullivan made a note in his log and continued monitoring. 3 hours later, At precisely 00 hours and 14 seconds, an identical signal appeared. Same frequency, same duration, same characteristics. Sullivan sat up straighter in his chair, adjusting his headphones. Twice in one evening could be coincidence, but the precision of the timing suggested something else. He checked his notes from previous days, but found nothing similar. This was either a new transmission pattern or something he had not noticed before. Over the next week, Sullivan began focusing more attention on the specific frequency where he had detected the signals. He adjusted his monitoring schedule to cover the time periods when they had previously appeared. The pattern became clearer. Brief transmissions, lasting between 3 and 7 seconds, appeared at irregular intervals, but always within specific time windows. Early morning transmissions clustered between 0500 and 0700 hours. Afternoon transmissions appeared between 1400 and 1600 hours. Evening transmissions occurred between 2100 and 2300 hours. The signals themselves carried no voice or Morse code traffic. They were simply clean carrier waves, brief pulses of radio energy that conveyed no obvious information. By early March, Sullivan had logged over 40 separate instances of these mysterious transmissions. He began to develop theories about their purpose. The regularity suggested automated equipment rather than manual operation. The specific timing windows corresponded roughly to standard military shift schedules. The clean signal characteristics indicated a fixed transmitter with stable power supply, not a mobile unit operating from vehicles or portable generators. Sullivan became increasingly convinced that he had detected some kind of timing or synchronization system, perhaps coordinating activities at a German military installation. The challenge was convincing anyone else that his observations mattered. Sullivan prepared a detailed report documenting the signals, including frequency data, timing information, and his analysis of possible purposes. He submitted it to his immediate supervisor, Lieutenant David Brennan, a signals officer, who had been with the unit since its formation in 1942. Brennan reviewed the report with the weary skepticism of an officer who had seen countless intelligence leads prove meaningless. In the chaos of war, with thousands of radio signals filling the spectrum every day, it was easy to find patterns that seemed significant but ultimately meant nothing. Lieutenant Brennan questioned Sullivan about his findings, asking the young sergeant to explain why brief timing signals deserved special attention when the unit was tracking hundreds of German communications networks across the European theater. Sullivan did his best to articulate his reasoning. The signals were too regular to be accidental, too precise to be atmospheric phenomena, and their timing corresponded to operational schedules that would make sense for a military installation. But he lacked concrete proof. He could not definitively identify the location of the transmitter beyond a general area in the Ruhr Valley. He could not prove the signals were actually coordinating military activities rather than serving some other technical purpose. Brennan thanked Sullivan for the report and told him he would forward it to higher headquarters for evaluation. In the meantime, Sullivan should continue his normal monitoring duties. The message was clear. Don't waste too much time chasing signals that probably meant nothing. Sullivan returned to his monitoring station frustrated but not defeated. He understood Brennan's skepticism. The lieutenant was responsible for managing intelligence production from 15 analysts, all of whom were monitoring different aspects of German communications. Devoting significant resources to investigating timing signals of unknown purpose was hard to justify when there were more obvious intelligence priorities demanding attention. But Sullivan could not let it go. The signals appeared with such regularity, such precision, that he was convinced they had to be deliberate. During his off-duty hours, he continued maintaining his separate log of the mysterious transmissions. He began cross-referencing his observations with other intelligence reports, looking for any correlation between the timing signals and German military activities in the region. He studied maps of the Ruhr Valley, trying to narrow down the possible location of the transmitter. He read technical manuals on German radio equipment, hoping to identify what type of transmitter might produce such clean, brief signals. The breakthrough came in mid-March when Sullivan requested access to aerial reconnaissance photographs of the Ruhr region. These photographs, taken by high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft, were maintained in a separate facility and required special authorization to access. Sullivan submitted a request through Lieutenant Brennan, explaining that he wanted to examine the area where his timing signals appeared to originate. Brennan, perhaps feeling slightly guilty about dismissing Sullivan's earlier report, approved the request and arranged for Sullivan to spend an afternoon at the Photographic Intelligence Unit. The Photographic Intelligence Facility was housed in a separate building, its walls covered with large-format aerial photographs showing targets across occupied Europe. Staff sergeants and photo interpreters worked at light tables, examining images through magnifying glasses, marking features of interest, comparing photographs from different dates to assess bomb damage and identify changes. Sullivan was met by a photo interpreter named Sergeant Robert Chen, a second-generation Chinese-American from San Francisco who had worked as a commercial photographer before the war. Chen listened to Sullivan's explanation about the timing signals and their estimated origin point, then led him to a filing cabinet containing recent reconnaissance photographs of the Ruhr Valley. The photographs were remarkable in their detail. Taken from altitudes above 20,000 feet, they showed the industrial landscape of the Ruhr with stark clarity. Factories, roads, rail lines, residential areas, all were visible in grayscale. Chen spread several photographs across a large table, pointing out various features and explaining how photo interpreters assessed bomb damage and identified targets. Sullivan studied the images, trying to correlate the estimated direction and distance of his radio signals with specific locations visible in the photographs. One complex caught his attention, located on the outskirts of Bochum, a mid-sized industrial city in the heart of the Ruhr, was a large facility that appeared to have suffered significant damage from bombing raids. The photographs showed destroyed buildings, cratered roadways, and collapsed structures, but amid the devastation, several large reinforced concrete buildings remained standing. The facility was surrounded by what appeared to be defensive positions, and at its center stood a distinctive tower structure, approximately 40 meters tall. Chen consulted his records and explained that the facility was a former coal processing complex, now believed to house German administrative offices and possibly storage for military equipment. Sullivan asked if he could see photographs of the facility from different dates. Chen pulled additional images from the files, arranging them chronologically. The sequence told an interesting story. The facility had been bombed multiple times over the past 2 years. Mission reports documented raids by the 8th Air Force in September 1943, January and March 1944, and most recently in November 1944. Each raid had involved substantial numbers of bombers dropping hundreds of tons of ordnance. Yet the central structures of the complex, particularly the distinctive tower, remained standing in every photograph. The reinforced concrete construction had proven remarkably resilient to aerial bombardment. Sullivan studied the tower structure with growing excitement. It was exactly the type of installation that would be ideal for mounting a radio antenna. The height would provide good signal propagation, the substantial construction would support antenna equipment, and the fortified nature of the facility would allow sensitive communications equipment to operate with protection from air attack. He asked Chen if there were any intelligence reports about the facility's current use. Chen checked his files and found assessment reports indicating the facility was believed to be partially operational, possibly serving administrative or logistics functions, but it was not considered a high-priority target, given the extensive damage to the surrounding industrial infrastructure. Sullivan returned to his monitoring station that evening with renewed conviction. The facility at Bochum matched perfectly with his estimated location for the timing signals. The tower structure provided a logical location for a transmitter. The facility's resistance to bombing suggested it might still house significant German military operations. And most importantly, if the signals were indeed coordinating activities within the facility, they represented a vulnerability that could potentially be exploited. He prepared a new report, more detailed than his first, incorporating the photographic evidence and his analysis of the facility's characteristics. This time he took his findings directly to Captain Raymond Mitchell, who commanded the entire Signals Intelligence section. Mitchell was a career officer who had been analyzing enemy communications since the North African campaign in 1942. He had seen countless intelligence leads that seemed promising but led nowhere, and he had learned to be skeptical of theories built on limited evidence. Mitchell reviewed Sullivan's report carefully, asking detailed questions about the signal characteristics, the timing patterns, and the correlation with the Bochum facility. He was particularly interested in the precision of the timing, noting that such regular transmissions would require sophisticated equipment and careful maintenance. After nearly an hour of discussion, Mitchell made a decision. He would forward Sullivan's analysis to Division Intelligence with a recommendation that the facility receive closer examination. But he was clear about the limitations. Without more concrete evidence, it was unlikely that anyone would authorize a major operation based solely on the detection of brief unidentified radio signals. The Division Intelligence staff took 2 weeks to respond. When their assessment came back, it was cautiously supportive. The timing signals Sullivan had detected were unusual enough to warrant further investigation. The Bochum facility was already on the target list for the upcoming ground offensive into the Ruhr, so additional intelligence about its status and purpose would be valuable. Division authorized enhanced reconnaissance of the facility, including infrared photography, to detect heat signatures that would indicate active operations, and directed Captain Mitchell to maintain continuous monitoring of the timing signals to establish whether their pattern remained consistent. Sullivan was assigned as the primary analyst for the Bochum facility signals. For the first time since arriving in England, he felt that his work might actually contribute something meaningful to the war effort. He intensified his monitoring, expanding his coverage to include adjacent frequencies and time periods. He began correlating the timing signals with other intelligence about German activities in the region, and he started to develop a deeper understanding of what the signals might actually represent. The pattern became clearer over the following weeks. The timing signals were not random or arbitrary. They followed a precise schedule that repeated every 24 hours. The early morning signals appeared consistently at 05:45 hours, marking what was likely the start of a day shift. The afternoon signals at 15:15 hours probably indicated an evening shift change. The late evening signals at 22:30 hours would correspond to a night shift beginning. The 3-shift schedule was typical of industrial or military operations that required continuous staffing. The fact that these shifts were being coordinated by radio signals suggested that the facility had personnel in multiple locations who needed to synchronize their activities. But Sullivan noticed something else that would prove crucial. The signals were not just timing markers. Their slight variations in duration and frequency suggested they might carry simple coded information, perhaps indicating different types of shifts or different security states. A signal that lasted exactly 5 seconds at 8.75 MHz might indicate a routine shift change. A signal lasting 7 seconds at 8.76 MHz might indicate a shift change with heightened security alert. These variations were subtle, but to personnel who worked with the system daily, they would convey important information without requiring voice communication that could be intercepted and understood by enemy intelligence services. This realization opened up a new possibility. If the timing signals were indeed carrying coded information that German personnel relied upon to coordinate their activities, then those signals represented not just an intelligence source, but a potential vulnerability. What would happen if the signals became unreliable? What if false signals were introduced, creating confusion about shift schedules and security states? Could the psychological impact of an apparently failing coordination system undermine the facility's operations, even if its physical structure remained intact? Sullivan brought this idea to Captain Mitchell in early April, as Allied ground forces prepared for the final push into the Ruhr. The military situation had changed dramatically since Sullivan first detected the timing signals in February. By early April, German forces throughout the region were under intense pressure. Supply lines were disrupted, communications networks were fragmenting, and morale among German troops was declining as the inevitability of defeat became apparent. In this context, even small disruptions to established procedures could have outsized psychological effects. Mitchell was intrigued by Sullivan's proposal, but skeptical about its practicality. The idea of using false radio transmissions to disrupt enemy coordination was not new. Signals deception and electronic warfare had been employed throughout the conflict, with varying degrees of success. But most such efforts focused on tactical communications, jamming radar systems, or spreading disinformation. Using radio signals to undermine an enemy facility's internal coordination procedures was a novel approach that had no established doctrine or proven track record. The discussion expanded to include Major Thomas Hendricks, the division intelligence officer responsible for target analysis throughout the Ruhr sector. Hendricks had been tracking German defensive positions in preparation for the ground offensive and was particularly interested in identifying which installations were still operational and which were merely ruins. The Bochum facility sat astride a key transportation corridor. If it was indeed housing significant German forces and serving as a command or logistics center, it could become a serious obstacle to advancing Allied troops. Hendricks asked Sullivan to brief him on the complete analysis, from the original detection of the signals through the photographic correlation and the proposed deception operation. Sullivan prepared thoroughly for the briefing, creating charts showing the signal patterns, maps indicating the facility's location and strategic significance, and a detailed technical explanation of how false timing signals could be generated and transmitted. The briefing took place on April 3rd in a conference room at division headquarters, with Hendricks, Mitchell, and several other intelligence officers in attendance. Sullivan was nervous as he began his presentation. He was a technical sergeant briefing field-grade officers on a proposal that was essentially unproven and based largely on his own observations and analysis. But as he walked through the evidence, the pattern of signals, the photographic correlation, and the technical feasibility of the deception operation, he found his confidence growing. The data supported his conclusions. The timing signals were real, regular, and consistent with coordination of operations at a fixed installation. The Bochum facility had the characteristics necessary to house such operations, and the psychological environment in April 1945, with German forces demoralized and systems breaking down, made enemy personnel more likely to believe that their equipment was failing, rather than that they were being deceived. The questions from the officers were pointed but not hostile. How certain was Sullivan that the signals originated from the Bochum facility and not some other location? Could there be alternative explanations for the timing patterns? What equipment would be required to generate false signals, convincing enough to fool German technicians who worked with the system daily? How long would the deception need to be maintained to have the desired psychological effect? Sullivan answered each question as best he could, acknowledging uncertainties where they existed, but presenting his reasoning clearly and supporting his conclusions with evidence. At the end of the briefing, Major Hendricks made his decision. The operation would proceed, but on a limited basis, with specific objectives and timeline. Sullivan would be given access to a powerful transmitter capable of replicating the timing signals. He would have 1 week to generate confusion within the Bochum facility, with success measured by observable changes in the facility's operations as detected by aerial reconnaissance. If the operation showed promise, it could be expanded or adapted for use against other targets. If it failed, the only cost would be a few days of radio operator time and the electricity to power the transmitter. Sullivan was both excited and apprehensive. He had convinced senior officers to approve an operation based on his analysis, but now he had to prove that his theory actually worked. Failure would not just be a professional embarrassment, it might mean that an important enemy facility remained operational, potentially costing lives when Allied ground forces eventually had to secure it by force. The transmitter Sullivan was given access to was a powerful piece of equipment normally used for broadcasting propaganda messages and false information to German forces. Located at a signal site in liberated Belgium, the transmitter had sufficient power to reach the Ruhr Valley with clear, strong signals. Sullivan worked with 3 technicians to calibrate the equipment, matching the frequency, power output, and signal characteristics of the authentic timing transmissions he had been monitoring. The calibration process took 2 full days. The transmitter had to produce signals that were identical to the authentic ones in every measurable way. Frequency accurate to within a few hertz, power output matched to avoid obvious differences, signal duration precise to within a fraction of a second, While the equipment was being prepared, Sullivan developed his deception plan. He would not simply jam the authentic timing signals or replace them with constant false transmissions. Such obvious interference would immediately alert German personnel that they were under electronic attack, and they would likely respond by shutting down their radio coordination system and reverting to alternative methods. Instead, Sullivan would introduce subtle confusion. He would allow some authentic signals to pass uninterrupted, establishing that the system was still operational. Then he would add false signals at random times within the normal transmission windows, creating the impression of equipment malfunction rather than enemy action. He would occasionally send multiple signals in rapid succession, suggesting signal reflections or system oscillations, and he would periodically remain silent during expected transmission windows, creating uncertainty about whether signals had been sent but not received. The psychological sophistication of this approach reflected Sullivan's understanding of both radio technology and human behavior. People are much more willing to believe their equipment is malfunctioning than that an enemy has somehow replicated their coordination signals. By introducing confusion gradually and intermittently, Sullivan hoped to undermine trust in the timing system while avoiding obvious signs of hostile action that would prompt immediate countermeasures. The operation began at 0530 hours on April 10th. Sullivan transmitted his first false timing signal, identical in frequency and duration to the authentic morning shift change signal that the facility normally broadcast. He waited, listening on his monitoring equipment for any response, any indication that his transmission had been detected or had any effect. There was nothing. He transmitted again at 0615, off schedule from the normal timing. Still no response. Over the next 48 hours, Sullivan maintained his pattern of intermittent false signals, carefully varying the timing and occasionally sending multiple transmissions to suggest equipment problems. By April 12th, he began to wonder if his approach was having any effect at all. His monitoring equipment showed that the authentic timing signals from the Bochum facility continued to appear on schedule, suggesting that German personnel were still using their system normally. Perhaps his false signals were being dismissed as interference or were not even being received clearly by equipment within the facility. The doubt was troubling. Sullivan had convinced senior officers to approve this operation, and if it produced no results, his credibility would be seriously damaged. Then, on the morning of April 13th, the first confirmation arrived. A routine reconnaissance flight over the Bochum facility photographed something unusual. Personnel were visible outside the buildings during what should have been a non-shift change period, mid-morning, when everyone should have been at their assigned work locations. Vehicles were moving within the compound, suggesting unusual activity. Most tellingly, personnel could be seen gathered around what appeared to be antenna installations, seemingly inspecting or working on the equipment. The photograph suggested that Sullivan's false signals were indeed having an effect. German personnel at the facility had noticed irregularities in their timing coordination system and were attempting to diagnose the problem. This was exactly the response Sullivan had hoped for. The confusion was being attributed to equipment malfunction rather than enemy action. The psychological impact was beginning to manifest. Major Hendricks ordered increased surveillance of the facility. Reconnaissance flights at 4-hour intervals documented growing disorganization. Security patrols appeared at irregular times, suggesting that shift schedules were becoming confused. Lights that had previously followed consistent patterns now switched on and off, seemingly at random. Thermal imaging showed increased activity in the technical areas of the complex, indicating personnel were working to resolve the perceived equipment problems. The facility was not shutting down, but its orderly operations were clearly being disrupted. Sullivan intensified his efforts. He began sending conflicting signals on slightly different frequencies, as if multiple timing systems were operating simultaneously but providing different information. He introduced subtle variations in signal duration and power level, just enough to create uncertainty, but not so much that they would be obviously false. He created patterns where authentic signals and false signals overlapped, making it impossible for German personnel to determine which transmissions were legitimate. The psychological impact must have been significant for the personnel inside the facility. Systems that had operated reliably for years were suddenly erratic. Shift changes that had occurred like clockwork were now confused and inconsistent. Equipment that had never failed was now sending contradictory information. For soldiers and technicians who had worked in the installation for months or years, the breakdown of these basic operational procedures would have been deeply unsettling, suggesting that the facility itself was becoming unreliable. By April 15th, aerial reconnaissance showed that vehicle traffic in and out of the facility had increased dramatically. Large trucks were photographed near the entrances, suggesting either evacuation or resupply efforts. Personnel were visible carrying boxes and equipment, loading vehicles. The facility appeared to be either relocating operations or preparing to abandon the site entirely. The orderly garrison that had maintained the installation for years was showing signs of confusion and disorganization. Sullivan continued transmitting false signals, now mixing them freely with the authentic timing transmissions. He sent signals at seemingly random times, created bursts of multiple rapid transmissions, and occasionally transmitted signals that deviated slightly from the normal frequency or duration. The effect was to create an impression of complete system failure, as if the timing coordination equipment was breaking down entirely. On the morning of April 16th, Sullivan transmitted what would be his most effective signal sequence yet. He had been analyzing the pattern of authentic transmissions and noticed that certain signal characteristics appeared more frequently during what he believed were security alert scenarios. These variations likely represented different types of timing messages, perhaps distinguishing between routine shift changes and situations requiring heightened security. Sullivan crafted a signal that matched the characteristics of what he believed were security alert transmissions. He sent it 3 times in rapid succession at 05:45 hours, exactly during the morning shift change period when the facility would be most vulnerable to confusion. The response was immediate and dramatic. Within 20 minutes of Sullivan's transmission, aerial reconnaissance detected massive movement within the facility. Personnel poured out of buildings in numbers far exceeding normal shift change patterns. Vehicles started moving throughout the compound. Activity that typically occurred over hours was compressed into minutes. The installation appeared to be in chaos. The false security alerts, received during the vulnerable period of shift change, when personnel were already transitioning and procedures were confused by days of unreliable timing signals, had triggered a cascade of emergency responses. Personnel, unable to trust their communication systems and believing they were under some form of attack or facing a critical security breach, initiated emergency procedures. In the confusion, with coordination systems already unreliable and trust in established procedures shattered, orderly operations broke down completely. By mid-morning on April 16th, reconnaissance photographs showed the Bochum facility in a state of near-complete evacuation. The parking areas that had been full of military vehicles were largely empty. The defensive positions around the perimeter appeared unmanned. Smoke rose from several locations within the complex, suggesting that equipment or documents were being destroyed as part of the evacuation. The fortress that had withstood years of bombing was emptying itself, not because it had been destroyed or captured, but because Sullivan's radio deception had made it seem uninhabitable. Allied ground forces reached the facility 3 days later, on April 19th. The advancing troops, elements of the 3rd Armored Division, had been briefed that the installation was a fortified position that might offer strong resistance. Intelligence reports indicated it was a significant German command and logistics center, heavily defended and potentially containing hundreds of soldiers. The assault plan involved substantial artillery preparation, followed by careful infantry clearing operations supported by armor. Instead, the reconnaissance elements that approached the facility on the morning of April 19th found it virtually deserted. The defensive positions were empty. The gates stood open. There was no resistance. A small rear guard of 23 German soldiers, apparently left behind to manage the final stages of the evacuation, surrendered immediately when American troops appeared. Their officer, a lieutenant who spoke some English, explained that the main garrison had evacuated days earlier due to critical equipment failures and security concerns. He seemed confused about exactly what had happened, mentioning problems with communication systems, unreliable shift coordination, and conflicting security alerts that had created panic within the facility. The American troops cautiously entered the complex, weapons ready, expecting ambushes or booby traps. They found neither. The facility was intact but empty. Personal belongings had been left in hasty departure. Equipment had been removed or destroyed. Documents had been burned. But the physical structure was undamaged and ready for immediate use by Allied forces. As engineers and intelligence personnel began examining the facility in detail, the full extent of Sullivan's achievement became clear. The complex was extraordinarily well fortified. The buildings visible from aerial photographs were merely the surface structures. Beneath them extended 4 underground levels, with reinforced concrete walls over 3 meters thick. These underground sections housed the critical operations, communications equipment, secure storage facilities, command centers, and barracks for hundreds of personnel. The construction was so robust that conventional bombing could never have penetrated these deep sections. The facility could have withstood a prolonged siege, supplied through underground passages that connected to the city's infrastructure. In the main communications room on the 2nd underground level, American Signal Corps technicians found the source of the timing signals that Sullivan had detected and then replicated. A dedicated transmitter connected to a precision clock system sat in a corner of the room. The clock face showed the correct time, and the transmitter appeared to be in perfect working order. According to the logbooks left behind during the evacuation, the system had operated continuously since its installation in June 1942, sending timing coordination pulses to personnel throughout the facility, until early April 1945, when unexplained irregularities began appearing. The system had performed flawlessly. The technicians examining the equipment found nothing wrong with it. The transmitter functioned perfectly. The clock was accurate. The antenna system was intact. By any technical measure, the timing coordination system should have continued operating normally. The German personnel who had evacuated the facility were convinced their equipment was failing. But in reality, it had been working correctly the entire time. What they had experienced was not equipment failure, but electronic deception, false signals so carefully crafted that they were indistinguishable from authentic ones, introduced in patterns designed to maximize confusion and undermine trust in the system. Documents recovered from the facility revealed its true significance and explained why its loss was such a blow to German defensive efforts in the Ruhr. The complex had served as a regional command center, coordinating German forces throughout the industrial valley. It housed the communications network, linking defensive positions across dozens of kilometers. It contained secure storage for sensitive intelligence materials and operational plans. Over 400 military and civilian personnel had been stationed there, including signals intelligence analysts, communications technicians, administrative staff, and security forces. The facility had been designated as a last resort defensive position, a place where German forces could consolidate if their lines collapsed elsewhere in the region. All of this had been abandoned because of radio signals. No bombs had penetrated the underground levels, no artillery had breached the reinforced walls, no infantry had assaulted the defenses. A radio operator in Belgium, transmitting brief pulses of electromagnetic energy, had convinced the facility's garrison that their position was untenable. It was an extraordinary achievement, one that would have profound implications for how military operations were conceived and executed in the years to come. The liberation of the Bochum facility had immediate tactical benefits. Allied forces used it as a forward headquarters for the final operations in the Ruhr Valley. The communications equipment, once thoroughly inspected and determined to be free of sabotage or monitoring devices, was repurposed to support Allied military communications. The secure underground spaces provided excellent protection for command staff and critical supplies. The facility, which had been a formidable obstacle in the path of the Allied advance, became instead a valuable asset, supporting the final defeat of German forces in the region. But the strategic implications extended beyond the immediate military value. Sullivan's operation demonstrated that electronic warfare and signals intelligence could achieve results impossible through conventional military means. Senior Allied commanders took notice. If a single radio operator with a transmitter could neutralize a fortress, what else might be possible using similar approaches? The concept of attacking an enemy's information systems rather than just their physical infrastructure opened new possibilities for military planning. Sullivan received formal recognition for his achievement. Major Hendricks personally presented him with a commendation, praising his technical skill, analytical persistence, and innovative thinking. He was promoted to Master Sergeant and offered a position with a newly forming electronic warfare section that would develop doctrine and techniques for future conflicts. But the recognition that meant most to Sullivan came from his fellow analysts in the Signals Intelligence section. They had watched him spend months chasing signals that everyone else dismissed as meaningless. They had seen him persist despite skepticism from superiors, and they had witnessed the vindication of his careful observations and analysis. Captain Mitchell, in a private conversation after the operation's success became known, told Sullivan that his persistence had been the key factor. Many analysts might have detected the timing signals, but few would have continued investigating after their initial reports were dismissed. Fewer still would have developed the connection to the Bochum facility and recognized the potential vulnerability. Sullivan's achievement was not just technical skill, but intellectual stubbornness, a refusal to accept that the patterns he observed were meaningless. The war in Europe ended less than 3 weeks later, on May 8, 1945. Sullivan remained with the 8th Air Force in England for several more months as occupation duties were sorted out and personnel began the long process of demobilization. He used the time to document his methods and write a detailed technical report on the Bochum operation, hoping that future signals intelligence personnel might benefit from his experience. The report was classified and remained so for decades, but within military signals intelligence communities, the story of the radio operator who brought down a fortress became a teaching case, an example of how careful analysis and creative thinking could achieve strategic results. Sullivan returned to Philadelphia in November 1945. The city had changed in the years he had been away, grown more crowded, more busy, as wartime production gave way to peacetime industry. He resumed his studies at technical school, completing his degree in electrical engineering. The credits he had earned before the war were still valid, and his military training counted towards several advanced courses, allowing him to graduate by summer 1946. The skills Sullivan had developed during the war, particularly his expertise in radio communications and signal analysis, were highly valued in the post-war economy. He received multiple job offers from companies involved in the emerging radio broadcasting and telecommunications industries. He accepted a position with Bell Laboratories in New Jersey, joining a research group working on radio propagation and antenna design. The work was interesting and paid well, but Sullivan found himself missing the intensity and purpose of wartime signals intelligence. Corporate research, while intellectually challenging, lacked the immediate significance of work that could save lives or change the outcome of battles. Over the years, Sullivan occasionally gave guest lectures at military signals schools, sharing his experiences and emphasizing the importance of careful observation and persistent analysis. He stressed to students that signals intelligence was not about dramatic code breaking or intercepting secret messages, though such activities were certainly important. It was about noticing patterns, understanding what they meant, and recognizing when those patterns revealed vulnerabilities or opportunities. The brief timing signals he had detected over the Ruhr Valley in February 1945 had seemed insignificant to everyone except him. Yet they had opened a path to neutralizing one of the most fortified positions in Western Europe. In 1968, as much of the classified material from World War II was being declassified and released to researchers, a military historian conducting research on electronic warfare contacted Sullivan. The historian had discovered references to the Bochum operation in intelligence archives and was trying to piece together what had actually happened. Sullivan agreed to an interview, meeting the historian at a coffee shop near his home in suburban New Jersey. The interview lasted several hours, with Sullivan recounting in detail the process of detecting the timing signals, analyzing their significance, convincing skeptical superiors, and ultimately executing the deception operation. The historian was particularly interested in the technical details of how Sullivan had replicated the timing signals and the psychological reasoning behind introducing confusion rather than simply jamming the German system. Sullivan explained that the operation's success depended on making German personnel believe their own equipment was failing, rather than making them aware they were under attack. Subtlety and deception had been more effective than brute force disruption. Near the end of the interview, the historian asked Sullivan if he had been surprised that his approach worked as well as it did. Sullivan smiled and shook his head. He explained that he had not been surprised the approach worked. He had understood from his analysis that the timing signals were integral to the facility's operations and that disrupting them would create significant problems. What had surprised him was how long it had taken to convince anyone to listen. He had spent weeks trying to get his superiors to take the signals seriously, repeatedly being told that his equipment was probably broken or that he was wasting time on meaningless interference. The most frustrating part of the entire experience had not been the technical challenges of replicating the signals or designing the deception operation. It had been the institutional resistance to taking his observations seriously until he had accumulated overwhelming evidence that the signals mattered. The historian asked Sullivan what lessons he thought modern military personnel should take from his experience. Sullivan thought carefully before responding. He said that technology and tactics would continue to evolve, but certain principles remained constant. Careful observation was essential. Patterns meant something, even when they seemed insignificant. Persistence in analysis was often more valuable than brilliant insights, and effectiveness in warfare did not always come from being stronger or more aggressive. Sometimes it came from understanding your opponent better than they understood themselves, but from finding the vulnerabilities in their systems and exploiting those vulnerabilities in ways they could not anticipate or defend against. Sullivan lived a long life, passing away in 1998 at the age of 76. His obituary in the Philadelphia newspapers mentioned his career at Bell Laboratories and his service in World War II, but included no details about the Bochum operation. The story remained known primarily within military signals intelligence circles, where it was used as a teaching case and an inspiration for future generations of analysts. But those who studied the operation understood its significance. It represented a turning point in how wars could be fought, demonstrating that information and deception could be as powerful as bombs and bullets. The physical legacy of Sullivan's achievement can still be seen today, though few recognize it. The Bochum facility remains standing, its exterior converted to commercial and industrial uses, while the underground sections remain sealed and unused. A small plaque on one of the buildings commemorates its liberation by Allied forces in April 1945, mentioning the 3rd Armored Division and the date of surrender. There is no mention of electronic warfare, timing signals, or the radio operator, whose transmissions emptied the fortress without firing a shot. History, as recorded in plaques and monuments, tends to favor dramatic visible achievements over subtle technical victories. But within the specialized community of signals intelligence professionals, electronic warfare specialists, and military historians who study information operations, the story of James Sullivan and the Bochum Fortress holds an honored place. It represents one of the earliest and most successful examples of using electronic means to achieve military objectives that conventional forces could not accomplish. The principles Sullivan demonstrated, understanding enemy systems, identifying patterns and vulnerabilities, using deception rather than destruction, have become foundational concepts in modern military doctrine. In an era of cyber warfare and information operations, where conflicts are increasingly fought through networks and systems rather than purely through physical force, Sullivan's achievement seems more relevant than ever. He was not stronger than his opponents. He did not have access to overwhelming resources or advanced technology. What he had was careful observation, patient analysis, creative thinking, and persistence in the face of institutional skepticism. These qualities allowed him to recognize a pattern others had missed, and to turn that pattern into a weapon more effective than any bomb. The Bochum operation also serves as a reminder about the nature of military intelligence work. The dramatic successes, the code-breaking triumphs and strategic insights that change the course of wars are rare. Most intelligence work is tedious, repetitive, and seemingly unrewarding. Analysts spend countless hours monitoring signals that mean nothing, documenting patterns that lead nowhere, preparing reports that are filed away and forgotten. Sullivan spent months listening to static and brief radio transmissions before he detected the pattern that would prove significant. He endured skepticism and dismissal from superiors who thought his work was pointless. Only his persistence, his refusal to dismiss his own observations even when others did, allowed his analysis to reach the point where it could influence operations. Modern signals intelligence agencies, cyber warfare units and information operations commands still face these same challenges. In the vast ocean of electronic communications, network traffic, and digital information that surrounds modern society, identifying the patterns that matter and distinguishing them from noise requires the same careful attention Sullivan demonstrated. The tools are more sophisticated, the volume of data is vastly greater, but the fundamental task remains the same. Observe carefully, analyze patiently, and recognize when patterns reveal vulnerabilities or opportunities. The story of how a radio operator's supposedly broken equipment brought down a German fortress is more than a curious historical footnote. It is a lesson about the value of technical expertise, the power of persistence, and the way that wars can be won through understanding rather than just through force. In April 1945, while massive armies clashed across Germany and cities fell to combined arms assaults, one young sergeant sitting in a transmitter site in Belgium demonstrated that sometimes the most effective weapon is not the loudest or most destructive, but the one that your enemy never sees coming. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.